Chapter 1. The fall was much shorter this time, almost short enough that it did not traumatize her further. Almost being the operative word as her heart leapt into her throat. Before she could really get invested in the fall, though, she hit the roof, bounced and plummeted the final 2 stories down to the ground level. Pain hammered through her again as she hit the grass, before fading again to leave a spinning nausea. Eyes screwed tight shut, she waited for the nausea to pass. This had been a trying day, and not one she really cared to continue if she was being honest. It was only the fact she was face down in what felt like a manicured lawn instead of comfy pillows and a duvet that finally convinced her she would have to keep trying for at least a little bit longer. Abazu? The voice provided the last needed impetus she needed to open her eyes. The spinning green crystal ball was the first thing she saw, standing out like a neon sign, and beneath it stood a man. Standing over her was an old but familiar face, someone she had seen hundreds of times in the past. His thin, twisted moustache and oiled-back black hair was set on a tight-lined, middle-aged face of a distinguished gentleman. He was a man comfortable in a velvet smoking jacket at any time of day, and wore his now, in a fetching diamond-patterned deep red. His eyes looked straight at her, with a dull quality to them that she could not explain. Mortimer Groth. Her childhood memories slipped in the name. Abasu? He inquired again, a look of concern on his face as he reached out a hand to help her. It took a moment for the seeming normality of this to register with her as she looked from the hand back to Mortimer's face once again. She reached up with her hand, which she still struggled to think of as hers, with the familiar skin and bones replaced with this bizarre skeletal rigging shape. Regardless of her disquiet at her own hand, it didn't stop Mortimer from pulling her to her feet, distracting her from the disquiet of her misshapen limbs. He towered over her, his hands on her shoulders, his face a mask of concern as he looked her over. "Tabutsu Nasa?" he asked in Simlish, the made-up language of the characters in the world, which would be used for speaking to each other. The My Simlish language was odd to hear in person. The disconnect of seeing all this from behind a monitor made the make-believe language seem cute and fun, but to have someone talking directly to her in it made her feel even further from home. She tried to meet his eye, and struggling to do so. "I'm sorry, Mortimer, I can't understand you." She tried to mime hearing, and then shrugged, trying to convey her words more clearly. It was a strange sensation to have a video game character standing in front of her, trying to speak to her as a person would. He moved stiffly through his animations, moving in an almost wooden or predetermined manner, but she could not bring herself to think of him as just a video game character when he seemed as large as life before her, particularly as she realized that she was only about half of his height. Mortimer scratched his head, speaking a few more words which were as useless as before. He seemed to realize that words were not going to work in this case. Instead, he mimed hitting his arm, and then looked pain, and then gestured to her with a questioning look. She patted herself, realizing she didn't actually hurt, and like the long fall before, had not taken any real physical damage from bouncing off his roof on her way down, and so shook her head to confirm she was indeed okay. A nod and a smile, and Mortimer beckoned her to follow, leading her inside the house. Nostalgia prickled at her thoughts. She knew this house inside and out just as well as the last one, although this one had not been created by her, and so had a more sensible layout created by the original developers. In a daze, she was led over to a couch and mimed to sit, and a brief moment later, a bowl of salad was placed on the coffee table in front of her, and after some gesturing, she guessed she was being asked to sit and relax, which she did, head in her hands, staring at the pixelated video game salad bowl in front of her. "I'm sitting on the sofa in a My Sims house. I'm in a video game," she muttered in disbelief. My Sims was an old simulator game she had played for many hours when she was a teenager, back when she had more time on her hands than she knew what to do with. The actual goal of the game was to build the ideal home for your My Sim characters, direct them to improve their lives, get better jobs, form relationships with other My Sims, and create a family. It was an open-ended game though, and without any actual end to it. She had spent hours upon hours building her ideal dream homes with infinite money cheats, before starting the game over and trying every combination of items and houses to make the most efficient houses for the least money, or build enormous mansions with 100 bathrooms, as either a challenge to herself or simply for some childish fun. To actually find herself sitting in one of those houses struck her as even more bizarre than the strange digital landscape she had just fallen out of. At least there, it was a strange and unusual place, but here it was familiar to her, since she had played so many hours as a child. Back then, she would manage her little My Sims characters from a godlike perspective as a player, hoping to improve their moods and keep their orbs a healthy green which showed their current happiness in their digital dollhouse. On impulse, she looked up, half expecting her own face to be looking down on her through the roof from on high, or for her to have her own gem hovering over her head to mock her. Yet, as she stared up at the ceiling, which looked as solid as ceilings tended to be, she realised that despite trying to picture it mentally, her own face wouldn't come to mind. It was like somebody had taken a black marker and scrubbed it across her thoughts, blanking out memories which she should know like the back of her hand. A now digital and blocky hand. Dread and confusion filled her as the realisation that her own face was impossible to picture. She launched herself off the couch, across the room and up the stairs to where she knew the bathroom would be, looking for the one thing she knew every bathroom would have, a mirror. She had to pull herself up onto the sink to get a proper look, thanks to her short stature. But as she looked into the mirror and locked eyes with herself, one small thought snuck up upon her as she looked over her blocky face, one she had dreaded to get confirmation to see. I look like a default alpha test character, she whispered to herself. A groan of despair came out, unable to be contained anymore as the final realization washed over her. Instead of what she had hoped to see, which was a normal-looking face with normal-looking hair and a normal-looking nose, all she saw was a blocky polygon sphere with oval orbs where her eyes were, heavy rectangular blocks for hair with some red cones protruding from her temples, and a complete lack of a nose. In short, she looks as far from human as it was possible to be. No, what am I? She muttered to herself over and over, unwilling to accept that what was looking at her from the mirror. She stood transfixed, mind racing, and felt as if she was drifting free of her body, disfigured and horrific body, and a face that didn't belong to her, but moved in the mirror in a cruel mimicry of her movements, just to mock her. This thing before her wasn't her. It wasn't her body. The fact she could not remember her own body right now was irrelevant. There was just one burning fact. This thing was not her body. It was a shell she was being forced to inhabit against her will. What had she done to deserve this? It was like the world was conspiring against her, to break her and drive sanity from her. She briefly wondered if she had done something to anger some deity she did not believe in. All she had been doing these last few years had been working on her own projects. Some noble idea it might lead to a game she could sell and make herself one of those up-and-coming tech millionaires. There had even been some thoughts that maybe she could sell her work to a huge tech company and live a life of leisure. Now, despite all of those months and even years of work, she was stuck in what seemed to be her copy of the My Sims game, and had no clue what she could do about it, or how it had even happened. Was she lying unconscious on her study floor, having had a seizure? Was this all a hallucination, or was she dying? Maybe she was already dead, and this was the afterlife for somebody who did not believe in religion. Anger surged through her. Whatever was happening, it wasn't fair, and this whole situation was out of her control. She did the only thing she was able to control at this moment that might relieve this building rage. She closed her eyes and punched the mirror. Normally, when a person punches a mirror, there's a few things you can expect to happen as a result. Pain is the most immediate thing to happen, and that duly presented itself. The next is a broken mirror, shattered into glass fragments, and that also followed as expected. What does not normally happen, however, is a stunning purplish flash and a loud blurt of corrupted noise. The mirror shattered into fragments, but instead of flying to the floor as it would normally be expected, the shards hung in the air and continued to twitch and vibrate where they dangled. Her hand blazed in pain, and she saw a comically large piece of the mirror sticking out of it, twitching like its newly created siblings. Mortimer had come running up the stairs to find her crouched on the floor nursing the hand, unwilling to touch the glass shard for fear of making it even worse. As he reached down to her, asking something in Mycenish, panic filled her, and she flailed reflexively, thrusting out her good hand to shove him away. The purplish flash and blurt of corrupted noise came again, and Mortimer was pitched over onto his back, grunting in shock. His green My-Sims orb shuddering to a dull orange tone. Well, that's just great, she thought to herself as the dust settled and she staggered up, muttering, I've only just killed the only non-player character here. As it turned out, though, her worry was premature, and despite the blow, Mortimer groaned and sat up with a hand clutched to his chest where he had been struck. Well, you certainly know how to treat your host, my dear. His voice took on a smart upper-class tone, one that sounded as if it had been bred into the family over the course of several centuries, and was used to speaking at dinner parties and to the servants. As he sat up, he realised he did so with a much more fluid grace than his normal game animation should allow for, as if he was suddenly free to move for the first time. The English words caught her off guard completely, and all she could do was stare and stutter out a vague, "What?" Mortimer cleared his throat and tried again. I said, you know how to treat your host, my dear. He trailed off as it dawned on him that she could now understand him. Mortimer flexed his mouth, feeling out the new sounds it was making. You can understand me, he said in a more of a statement than a question. But she nodded all the same. And I can understand you as well. Again, a statement and a nod. Well then, that makes this next part easier for both of us. He looked down at Alpha's wounded hand, cradled close to her chest. With a flourish, he gestured an arm towards her. Your hand? His cultured tone saying more about his invitation than words did. The reminder brought her out of her shock, and the pain in her hand chose that moment to get her attention once more. She winced and whimpered, her knees feeling weak under her as the pain took place as the most pressing of concerns. Mortimer helped gently lower her to the ground once more, and looked over the hand, his brow furrowed. Well, my dear, I'm not a doctor, but I believe this will need to come out. As he reached to grasp the shard, her whimpering increased. Fingers pinched close on the shard, he felt the vibrations as it tried to push itself out through the other side of the hand it was currently lodged in. Now, this might hurt, but what is that? His other hand pointed to the other side of the bathtub, and she reflexively looked at where he indicated. He moved quickly, as soon as she was distracted by his gesture. A sudden yank, and the shard was free, thrown across the room where it seemed to pin itself in the air just like the other shards had. The relief was instantaneous. The moment the shard had been removed, it was as if there had never been any pain at all. The sudden release from the agony was a calming balm in contrast of what had been before. He hiccuped. His work was done. Mortimer stood in a smooth motion and bent smartly towards her. Another flourish, and he was offering her his hand with a slick smile. Then, I think I have some questions for you, my dear, if you would be so good as to follow me. Back in the sitting room, Mortimer reclined in his comfy chair, while she sat across from him in her spot on the sofa once again. So, said Mortimer slowly as he pressed his hands together and gestured to her, I can understand you now. She nodded, not really looking at him as she stroked the back of her hand where the glass had been. And you can understand me? Another nod. And, given your general confusion and nervousness, I take it you do not understand how this happened either. Her head drooped and a tiny no escaped her lips. He paused, looking contemplative as the confirmation of these facts failed to give much in the way of real answers. Mortimer sighed, straightening up. I suppose I should probably start at the beginning then, and pressed a hand to his chest. My name is Mortimer Groth, and this is my humble abode. He paused, looking contemplative as the confirmation of these facts failed to give much in the way of real answers. Mortimer sighed, straightening up. I suppose I should probably start at the beginning then, and pressed a hand to his chest. My name is Mortimer Groth, and this is my humble abode, and you are my unexpected guest here, it seems. You are welcome to stay as long as you need, but I do need to ask one thing of you. Who do I have the pleasure of hosting in my house? The rather distinguished manner of speaking was quite appropriate for Mortimer, who was always modelled as a wealthy neighbour for the players' mysims to interact with. She looked up at the ceiling again, hoping beyond hope her face would appear above. But when that vain hope did not come to pass, she sighed. I think I'm a human being who is the player of this game, stuck in a video game. Moments passed as Mortimer stared at her. Stupid, she berated herself internally as the silence dragged out. If she had announced something like that to a stranger, or even friends of family, they would have rightly called an ambulance, or worse, and sent her to a psychiatric hospital, thinking she had played one too many games at last. To say it to somebody she at least suspected might be a non-player character or NPC in the game. What would he even think about this? Would his mind be blown to discover he was an NPC? Would he simply be unable to comprehend the concept of being a character in a video game? Or maybe it was worse than she thought. Maybe she really had gone off the deep end and was in the middle of a psychotic breakdown, brought on by too many sleepless nights and long days of coding. If that was the case, she thought, at least I might just wake up from it sooner or later. Better than the other option that this is some unrealized purgatory, or a hallucination brought on by a medical emergency as she lay on the floor of her study. After what felt like the longest moment, Mortimer spoke again. Well, I would not have to say stuck. It is rather nice here after all. It had not occurred to her that her statement would have been understood. You know you're a game character, she blurted. Well, of course. It's been some time since we've been played, but it's not something you can really ignore after all. She slumped back on the sofa. Oh, the nerves drained out of her. Not to mention, your little slap earlier seems to have brought with it not just some linguistic flexibility, but a measure of clarity of thought I can't say I've had before. His hand patted to his chest where she had struck him. And I'm not the sort of gentleman who would tell a lady she is wrong about something she seems so certain about. Such a cheesy line delivered with such a straight face actually made her laugh, feeling the mood lighten at his words. But you missed my question earlier. You might be from elsewhere, but what is your name? Oh, sorry, she apologized, embarrassed as she had missed it. My name is... Her face froze as the inky black of obscured memory blotted out the name from her mind. The light mood evaporated in an instant, and it was all she could do to stutter over and over. My name is... The panic rising again, she clutched her head in her hands. What is my name? Why don't I know my own name? The idea that she could forget something so vital hit her harder than anything else had so far. To lose her body and to be forced into this strange digital replacement was one thing, but to forget her very name was like losing a chunk of her own humanity. Mortimer's hands were on her shoulders. Look at me, he said in a voice that was unmistakably a command. She complied without thinking, heart racing from the anxiety, her lips silently mouthing the words over and over. His face was inches from her, and the surprise made her jump. Not giving her a chance to respond, Mortimer barreled on. If you cannot remember your name, we will help you find it. He said it with so much firm conviction, it was actually encouraging to hear. But if I can't remember my name, then who am I? She said blankly, unable to imagine how to take the next step. That is down for you to find out, I'm afraid. I would not leave somebody in need, so I will do what I can to help in any way I can. He looked her in the eye. It does not matter what you don't remember. We will find it for you somehow. But to begin, we need to know what you do remember about yourself still. He raised his eyebrow questioningly. So, the question is, what do you know about yourself?